The cruelest jokes are often the ones told by people who never realize they are revealing their own hearts. The evening rush at the Sterling table was reaching its peak, and the elegant restaurant glowed beneath warm golden lights as guests filled every polished table. Servers moved quickly between the kitchen and the dining area, carrying carefully prepared dishes while soft conversations blended with the sound of silverware and quiet music. Behind the scenes, Naomi Brooks adjusted her uniform, checked her order pad, and prepared herself for another demanding shift. At 26 years old, the black waitress had learned that working in a busy restaurant required more than speed. It required patience, kindness, and the ability to remain calm even when others forgot the importance of respect. Naomi had always believed that every person who entered the restaurant deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance, background, or circumstances. But not everyone at the Sterling table shared that belief. Several co-workers often laughed at her gentle personality, calling her too trusting and too polite. They believed kindness was a weakness in a world where confidence and popularity mattered more. That evening, a few employees gathered near the service station, whispering and exchanging amused looks while watching a distinguished man sitting alone near the window. His name was Ethan Walker, a 42-year-old white Korean Mafia boss known in business circles for his intelligence, discipline, and enormous influence. Few people knew much about his private life because Ethan rarely appeared in public without a purpose. What most people noticed first was his silence. Ethan was deaf, and he communicated through careful observation, written notes, and a deep understanding of expressions and gestures. Instead of showing compassion, some employees saw an opportunity to make someone else uncomfortable. They decided to assign Naomi to his table, expecting her to struggle and become the evening's entertainment. "Let us see how long her perfect manners last," one co-worker whispered with a smile. They believed Ethan would be difficult to serve and that Naomi would embarrass herself trying to communicate with him. Naomi, unaware of their plan, simply picked up the menu and walked toward the table. As she approached, she noticed Ethan sitting quietly, observing the room with calm eyes. Unlike many guests who demanded attention, he seemed comfortable in his own space. Naomi immediately recognized something others ignored. He was not someone to laugh at. He was simply someone who experienced the world differently. She placed the menu gently on the table and offered a warm smile before writing a short note explaining that she could communicate however he preferred. Ethan looked at the message, then looked back at her with a slight surprise. For a moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to disappear. He was used to people speaking around him, avoiding conversation, or treating his silence as something uncomfortable. But Naomi did something different. She treated him like everyone else. Across the room, the co-workers waited for a mistake, ready to laugh at what they thought would happen next. They had no idea that the person they intended to humiliate was about to create a moment that would change the entire room. And they had no idea that the quiet man sitting by the window was not someone they should underestimate. Naomi remained beside the table with a quiet confidence, allowing Ethan all the time he needed instead of rushing him as many guests had done before. She placed a small notepad and pen beside the menu with a gentle smile, then pointed politely to the page before lightly placing her hand over her heart to show she was happy to communicate in whatever way made him comfortable. Ethan looked at the gesture, then slowly smiled in return. It was a small smile, almost unnoticeable to everyone except Naomi, but it carried genuine appreciation. He wrote a short message thanking her for asking instead of assuming. Naomi read the note, smiled again, and carefully wrote that every guest deserved to be treated with respect because everyone communicated differently. Ethan looked at her words for several thoughtful seconds before writing his meal choice along with a brief thank you. Across the dining room, the group of coworkers continued watching from behind the service station. They had expected confusion, awkward silence, or visible frustration. Instead they saw something they could not understand. The conversation was flowing naturally without many spoken words. Naomi never showed embarrassment. Ethan never appeared uncomfortable. Their quiet exchange somehow felt warmer than many conversations taking place throughout the busy restaurant. One coworker whispered that the joke was failing, while another insisted Naomi would eventually make a mistake. They continued waiting, convinced that humiliation was only a matter of time. Naomi carried Ethan's order into the kitchen with the same professionalism she showed every customer. She carefully explained every detail to the chef, making certain the meal matched exactly what Ethan had requested in writing. While the food was being prepared, she returned with a glass of water and another handwritten note asking whether he needed anything else. Ethan responded with a simple sentence that surprised her. He wrote that very few people looked directly at him while communicating. Most spoke only to the person beside him or avoided conversation completely. Naomi gently shook her head before writing back that kindness should never depend on convenience. Ethan quietly read the sentence twice, as though committing it to memory. For the first time in a very long while, he felt completely included rather than accommodated. Around them, nearby diners gradually noticed the peaceful interaction unfolding at the window table. Instead of seeing difficulty, they saw patience. Instead of discomfort, they saw mutual respect. A young child seated with his family pointed toward Naomi and smiled after watching her communicate with Ethan using notes, gestures, and warm expressions. The child's parents smiled as well, recognizing the quiet beauty of the moment. When the meal arrived, Naomi carefully placed every dish exactly where Ethan could comfortably reach it before stepping back to allow him space. She never exaggerated her movements or treated him differently from anyone else. She simply remained attentive, observant, and respectful. Ethan looked up once more before beginning his meal and offered another sincere smile. It was enough for Naomi to know she had done her job well. But behind the service station, the coworkers exchanged increasingly uneasy glances because nothing had happened according to their plan. Instead of becoming the evening's joke, Naomi had somehow transformed the restaurant's quietest table into the one every thoughtful guest had begun to notice. And just as the atmosphere throughout the dining room subtly shifted, the front entrance opened, and several professionally dressed assistants walked calmly inside, immediately searching the room for one particular guest. The restaurant gradually settled into an unusual silence that nobody could explain. The lively conversations, the clinking glasses, and the constant movement of servers continued as before, yet more and more guests found themselves glancing toward the quiet table beside the window. There was nothing dramatic happening there. A deaf man and a young waitress were simply communicating with patience, handwritten notes, genuine smiles, and quiet respect. Somehow, that ordinary kindness had become the most remarkable moment in the room. Ethan continued enjoying his meal while Naomi checked on him from a comfortable distance, never hovering, never making him feel different from anyone else. Each time she approached, she waited until he looked up before speaking with gentle expressions and simple gestures that allowed him to understand without difficulty. Ethan appreciated every thoughtful detail. Throughout his life, he had learned to recognize the difference between politeness offered out of obligation and kindness offered from the heart. Naomi belonged to the second kind. She was not performing for compliments or trying to impress anyone. She simply believed that every person deserved dignity. Ethan found himself watching her as she moved gracefully from table to table. She treated an elderly couple with the same warmth she showed a family celebrating a birthday. She smiled at nervous first-time diners, patiently answered questions, and thanked every guest sincerely. Her kindness never changed depending on who stood before her. For a man surrounded by people whose behavior often depended on status and influence, that consistency felt almost extraordinary. Nearby, the co-workers who had created the cruel prank were growing increasingly uncomfortable. Instead of laughing, they found themselves wondering why Ethan looked more relaxed than when he had first arrived. One of them quietly admitted that he had never seen anyone communicate with a deaf guest so naturally. Another quickly dismissed the thought, insisting the evening was not over yet. They still believed something embarrassing would happen eventually. Then the restaurant entrance opened once again. 3 professionally dressed assistants entered with calm confidence, followed by a distinguished older gentleman carrying a leather portfolio. None of them caused a scene. Instead, they quietly approached the reception desk before respectfully asking to speak with the restaurant manager. Within moments, the manager hurried from his office, immediately recognizing the visitors. His expression changed from routine professionalism to visible surprise. After a brief conversation, the manager looked across the dining room toward Ethan's table, then straightened his jacket before walking carefully in that direction. Several employees noticed the sudden change in his behavior. The whispers behind the service station slowly disappeared. Naomi, unaware of what was unfolding, returned to Ethan's table carrying a fresh cup of coffee exactly as he had requested. She gently placed it before him, along with another small handwritten note asking whether everything had met his expectations. Ethan looked at the message, then wrote a reply that made Naomi smile. He thanked her for giving him something he rarely experienced in public: normalcy. Before Naomi could respond, the restaurant manager arrived beside the table. He offered Ethan a respectful nod that was noticeably different from the greeting given to ordinary customers. The assistants quietly stopped several feet behind him while the entire dining room seemed to pause without understanding why. Ethan calmly looked up from his coffee, meeting the manager's eyes with the same composed expression he had worn all evening. At that exact moment, the co-workers who had arranged the humiliating joke suddenly realized they might have misunderstood not only the quiet man sitting by the window, but also the extraordinary importance of the guest they had chosen to underestimate. The restaurant manager stopped beside Ethan's table, his posture noticeably straighter than before, while the three assistants remained respectfully behind him without speaking. The cheerful atmosphere that had filled the dining room only minutes earlier slowly faded into quiet curiosity. Guests paused their conversations, servers slowed their steps, and even the kitchen staff glanced through the service window after noticing the unusual attention surrounding the quiet customer near the window. Naomi stood politely beside the table, believing the manager had simply come to ask whether everything had been satisfactory. She smiled gently and prepared to step away so they could speak privately. Instead, the manager turned toward her with an expression she had never seen before. It was not annoyance or criticism. It was surprise mixed with genuine respect. Ethan calmly reached for the small notebook still resting on the table and wrote several short sentences before handing it to his lead assistant. The assistant read the message, nodded once, and then addressed the manager in a calm professional voice. Mr. Walker would like to thank this waitress personally. He says she is the first employee this evening who treated him as a guest instead of treating his hearing loss as the most important thing about him. The words echoed quietly across the nearby tables. Naomi blinked in surprise, clearly embarrassed by the unexpected attention. She gently shook her head and smiled. I only did what every server should do, she replied sincerely. The assistant translated her response onto the notepad. Ethan read it carefully before another warm smile appeared across his face. It was the second genuine smile anyone had seen from him that evening. The manager suddenly realized who was sitting before him. Only hours earlier he had received confidential notice that the owner of the international investment group preparing to purchase a controlling interest in the restaurant company would be visiting several locations anonymously to observe customer service firsthand. The description matched perfectly. The quiet man sitting at the window was not simply an important businessman. He was the investor whose decision could influence the future of every restaurant in the company. The manager's face became pale as the realization settled in. Behind the service station, the co-workers who had arranged the cruel joke stared at one another without speaking. The confidence they had shown only minutes earlier completely disappeared. They remembered every whispered laugh, every mocking comment, and every careless assumption they had made about both Naomi and the silent customer. None of it seemed amusing anymore. Ethan remained perfectly calm. He neither demanded apologies nor displayed anger. Instead, he wrote another brief message and handed it to his assistant. The assistant looked toward the manager before reading the note aloud. Mr. Walker wishes to compliment the professionalism of Miss Brooks. Her patience, respect, and thoughtful communication represent the standard every guest deserves. The manager slowly turned toward Naomi with visible admiration. Several nearby diners quietly began applauding, not because someone wealthy had spoken, but because they had witnessed genuine kindness receive the recognition it deserved. Naomi's cheeks became slightly flushed as she lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention. She had never expected that simply treating another person with dignity would lead to such a moment. Yet as Ethan looked at her with a quiet appreciation, he realized something equally important. In a world where people often judged others by appearances, status, or limitations, Naomi had been the only person in the room who had seen him exactly as he hoped to be seen. And for the first time that evening, the coworkers understood that the greatest mistake they had made was never assigning Naomi to Ethan's table. It was believing kindness could ever be used as a joke. The following days at the Sterling table felt different, as if the entire restaurant had quietly changed after one unexpected evening. The same polished tables, warm lighting, and busy kitchen remained exactly the same, yet the way people looked at one another had shifted. The employees who once laughed at Naomi's gentle nature now watched her with a new sense of respect. She never mentioned what happened that night. She never reminded anyone that she had been the only person who treated Ethan Walker with simple human kindness. To Naomi, it was never a performance. It was simply the way she believed people should be treated. Ethan, however, could not forget the moment. During his long career, he had attended countless business meetings, met influential leaders, and entered rooms where people immediately recognized his position. But almost every interaction came with expectations attached. People often changed their behavior when they knew his identity. They became more careful with their words, more eager to impress, and less honest with their reactions. Naomi had been different because she had no idea who he was. She had not seen a powerful businessman, a wealthy investor, or someone with influence. She had simply seen a person sitting alone who deserved patience. That difference stayed with him. Several days later, Ethan returned to the Sterling table without announcing his arrival. He arrived in the afternoon when the restaurant was quieter, wearing the same simple charcoal suit and carrying the same calm expression he always had. Naomi was surprised to see him again, but she greeted him with the same warm smile she had shown the first night. She did not become nervous. She did not treat him differently. She simply welcomed him as a guest. Ethan noticed immediately. He wrote a short message asking how her day had been. Naomi smiled as she answered that it was busy but rewarding because she enjoyed making people feel comfortable. Ethan looked at the message for a long moment. Those simple words reflected exactly what he had admired about her. She found purpose in helping others, even when nobody was watching. During their conversation, Naomi learned small details about Ethan's life. She discovered that his schedule was often filled with meetings across different cities, that he carried enormous responsibilities, and that silence had become a familiar part of his world long before people understood his hearing loss. Yet she never treated his silence as something sad or limiting. She simply accepted it as part of who he was. Before leaving, Ethan thanked her for the meal and wrote another message. He explained that many people focused on what he could not hear, but she was the first person in years who made him feel understood without needing to say much at all. Naomi read the message carefully and replied that everyone deserved to be seen for who they were, not for what others assumed about them. Ethan kept those words with him long after he left the restaurant. Outside, the city continued moving through another ordinary afternoon. Cars passed, people rushed between buildings, and countless conversations filled the streets. But for Ethan, something had quietly changed. He had spent years believing that trust was difficult to find because everyone wanted something from him. Naomi had reminded him that genuine kindness still existed. And while she returned to her work believing she had simply done her job, Ethan walked away knowing he had met someone who had given him something far more valuable than a pleasant dining experience. She had given him a reason to believe that being truly understood was still possible. Over the next several weeks, Ethan's visits to the Sterling table became quietly familiar. He never reserved the finest table, never arrived with an entourage, and never asked for special treatment. Most evenings he entered alone, greeted the hostess with a polite smile, and chose the same seat beside the large window overlooking the city lights. Naomi always welcomed him with the same calm warmth she offered every guest, refusing to let his wealth or reputation change the way she treated him. Their conversations remained simple. A notepad rested between them, carrying handwritten sentences that often said far more than spoken conversations around them. Ethan gradually learned that Naomi worked extra shifts to help support her widowed mother and younger brother, yet she never complained about long hours or difficult customers. She believed every honest job deserved pride, and every difficult day ended a little easier if she knew she had treated people with kindness. Naomi, in return, slowly discovered pieces of Ethan's life that newspapers never reported. He explained through short written messages that growing up with hearing loss had taught him patience but had also surrounded him with loneliness. Many people spoke for him instead of speaking to him. Others assumed silence meant weakness or a lack of intelligence. Even after building an enormously successful business career, those assumptions had never completely disappeared. Naomi carefully read each sentence before looking directly into his eyes. She wrote only one reply. People hear with their ears. Respect listens with the heart. Ethan stared at those words for several quiet moments before carefully folding the note and placing it inside his wallet instead of leaving it on the table. Naomi smiled shyly, surprised that something written so simply could matter so much. Ethan wanted her to understand. He wrote another message explaining that during years of meetings, negotiations, and formal dinners, countless people had complimented his success. Very few had ever reminded him of his humanity. That evening, after finishing his meal, Ethan asked whether Naomi's shift would end soon. She nodded and explained she had only 30 more minutes before closing duties. Instead of leaving immediately, Ethan remained seated with a cup of coffee, reading quietly while waiting. Several co-workers noticed but said nothing. The atmosphere inside the restaurant had changed completely since that first evening. The whispers had disappeared, replaced by quiet reflection. Even those who had once mocked Naomi now found themselves greeting every guest more thoughtfully, remembering how easily appearances could deceive. When Naomi finally finished work, she stepped outside into the cool evening air carrying her light jacket over one arm. Ethan was waiting near the entrance beneath the soft glow of the streetlights. He handed her a small paper bag from a nearby bakery along with another. Handwritten note. Inside the bag was her favorite cinnamon pastry, something he had remembered from one of their earlier conversations. The note simply read, "Kindness deserves to be remembered." Naomi looked up with genuine surprise before thanking him with a smile that needed no words. Together they walked slowly toward the corner of the block, speaking through brief handwritten notes and quiet laughter that required no sound to feel complete. For the first time in many years, Ethan realized he was no longer returning to the restaurant because of the food. He returned because every visit reminded him that understanding could begin with something as small as a patient smile, a sheet of paper, and one person willing to see beyond what the rest of the world had overlooked. The relationship between Ethan and Naomi continued to grow through moments that seemed ordinary to everyone else but carried deeper meaning for both of them. Neither tried to rush what was happening. They understood that trust was not created through impressive promises or dramatic gestures. It was built through small choices made consistently over time. Ethan still arrived at the Sterling table quietly, usually after long days filled with meetings and decisions. Yet the moment he stepped inside the restaurant, the weight of his responsibilities seemed to become lighter. Naomi always greeted him with the same genuine smile, never asking about his business or treating him differently because of his success. She simply asked about his day, and somehow that simple question meant more to him than many formal conversations he had experienced throughout his life. One evening, after the dinner crowd had become calmer, Ethan wrote a message asking Naomi if she would like to walk through the nearby park after her shift. Naomi hesitated for a moment because she was not used to receiving personal attention from someone like him. But when she saw his respectful expression, she agreed. The city streets were peaceful that night, with the soft lights reflecting on the sidewalks and a gentle breeze moving through the trees. They walked slowly, communicating through written notes on Ethan's phone and occasional gestures that had become familiar between them. Naomi learned that Ethan enjoyed simple things more than people expected. He liked quiet mornings, old books, and places where he could exist without being recognized. Ethan learned that Naomi dreamed of opening a small community cafe someday, a place where anyone could feel welcome regardless of their circumstances. As they reached a bench overlooking a small lake, Ethan looked across the water before writing something that made Naomi pause. He explained that for years he believed his hearing loss forced him to build walls around himself. He thought silence would always separate him from other people. Naomi read his message carefully and responded with a gentle smile. She wrote that silence was not always an absence. Sometimes silence gave people the chance to notice things they normally ignored. Ethan looked at the words and realized she understood something about him that many people never tried to understand. She did not see his deafness as a limitation. She saw it as one part of a much larger person. When they returned to the restaurant later that evening, several employees noticed the difference in Ethan. The usually distant businessman appeared more relaxed, more open, and more connected to the people around him. Naomi had not changed him by trying to fix him. She had changed him by accepting him completely. The coworkers who once planned to embarrass her quietly watched from across the room. They remembered how they had judged both of them without knowing anything about their stories. They had seen a deaf man and a waitress and assumed they understood everything. They never imagined that the person they tried to humiliate would become the person Ethan trusted most. Before leaving, Ethan stopped near the service station and thanked every employee for their work. Then he looked toward Naomi and gave a small respectful nod. It was a simple gesture, but everyone noticed it. The powerful man who owned companies and influenced decisions was showing gratitude to the person who had shown him kindness when nobody else did, and in that quiet moment, the entire restaurant understood that respect was never about status. It was about how someone treated another human being when there was nothing to gain. As autumn slowly settled over the city, Ethan and Naomi discovered that the strongest connections often grew in the quiet spaces between ordinary days. Neither of them spoke about the future directly, yet both found themselves making room for each other without even realizing it. Ethan adjusted business meetings so he could visit the restaurant more often, while Naomi found herself looking toward the entrance whenever the evening dinner service began. She never expected him to arrive, yet she always smiled when he did. One crisp evening after the restaurant closed, Ethan invited Naomi to visit the rooftop garden of one of his office buildings. The rooftop overlooked thousands of city lights stretching toward the horizon while a cool breeze carried the sounds of distant traffic far below. It was peaceful, private, and far removed from the crowded restaurants and formal meeting rooms that had filled Ethan's life for so many years. They sat together beneath soft lights surrounded by carefully maintained flowers and small trees that remained beautiful even as the seasons changed. Ethan handed Naomi a notebook instead of writing on separate sheets of paper as they usually did. He smiled gently, inviting them both to share one conversation across the same pages. Naomi laughed quietly before writing that she liked the idea because it felt more personal. Ethan nodded and began writing slowly. He admitted that before meeting her, he had accepted loneliness as something permanent. Success had given him influence, comfort, and security, but it had never given him peace. Every room he entered expected something from him. Every conversation carried hidden intentions. For years he believed that was simply how life worked. Naomi carefully read every word before looking at him with compassionate eyes. She wrote that sometimes people spent so much time protecting themselves from disappointment that they accidentally protected themselves from happiness as well. Ethan remained still while reading her sentence. It felt less like advice and more like someone quietly opening a door he had never noticed before. He turned another page and continued writing. He explained that when his hearing loss became more noticeable during childhood, many people unintentionally made him feel invisible. They spoke around him instead of including him. Even after becoming successful, that feeling never disappeared completely. Naomi reached for the notebook once more and wrote only a few words. I never saw someone who needed fixing. He only saw someone worth knowing. Ethan read the sentence twice before gently closing the notebook for a moment. He looked toward the glowing skyline, taking a slow breath as emotion quietly settled across his face. After several moments he opened the notebook again and wrote the words he had carried inside for weeks. He thanked Naomi for reminding him that respect could sound louder than words, and that genuine kindness could reach places no voice ever could. Naomi felt warmth fill her heart as she read his message. Without hesitation she gently placed her hand over his, offering reassurance without needing another sentence. The city lights shimmered beneath the clear night sky while neither of them felt any need to hurry the moment. They had discovered a language built from patience, trust, and understanding, one that required neither perfect hearing nor endless conversation. As they finally stood to leave, Ethan smiled with a quiet confidence Naomi had never seen before. For the first time in many years, he no longer feared the silence surrounding his world because someone had shown him that the right person would always know how to fill it with understanding. Months later, the Sterling table had become a place where everyone understood the value of respect a little differently. The same restaurant that once carried whispers and unfair assumptions had transformed into a space where patience and kindness were noticed by everyone who walked through the door. Naomi continued working with the same dedication she had always shown. She never changed because of recognition, and she never treated kindness as something special to her, it was simply the right thing to do. Ethan remained a familiar presence, but he was no longer the distant man who sat alone beside the window. He still carried the same quiet confidence, the same careful way of observing the world, but something inside him had changed. He laughed more often. He connected with people more openly. He allowed others to see the person behind the reputation. One evening, Ethan returned to the restaurant where their story had begun. This time, he did not arrive as an important businessman or a powerful figure. He arrived simply as Ethan. Naomi noticed the difference immediately. There was a calmness in his expression that had not been there before. As they sat together near the same window table, Ethan opened the notebook they had shared during their first conversations. The pages contained small memories written over many weeks, simple sentences that represented moments neither of them wanted to forget. Ethan wrote that he had spent years believing people would always judge him by what they saw first. His business success. His silence. His differences. But Naomi had shown him something he had forgotten. The world still contained people who looked deeper than appearances. Naomi smiled as she read his words and wrote her own message. She explained that she never saw a powerful man who needed to prove anything. She saw someone who deserved the same patience and understanding that everyone else deserved. Ethan looked at the sentence for a long time before quietly closing the notebook. Outside the window, the city continued moving with endless energy. Cars passed through the streets, lights filled the buildings, and strangers continued their own stories without knowing how much one small act of kindness had changed two lives. The coworkers who once tried to embarrass Naomi eventually apologized. They admitted they had judged both of them without knowing their stories. Naomi accepted their apology because she believed people could learn from their mistakes. Ethan never needed revenge or public recognition. The greatest lesson came from the simple truth that kindness had already spoken louder than any punishment could. Later that night, Ethan and Naomi walked outside beneath the soft glow of the streetlights. The city air was cool, and the streets were peaceful after the busy evening. Ethan looked at Naomi and wrote one final message in their notebook. You showed me that being understood matters more than being admired. Naomi smiled before writing her response. And you showed me that people are always more than what others assume. Together, they continued walking through the city, two people from different worlds who had discovered the same truth. A person's value was never measured by status, appearance, or the opinions of others. It was measured by the kindness they offered when nobody expected it, the quiet waitress who refused to judge a stranger and the powerful man who had spent years feeling unseen had found something neither of them was searching for. They had found trust, respect, and a connection built on seeing each other exactly as they were. And that evening, in the same city where they first met, The word remembered that the strongest conversations are sometimes the ones spoken without a single word.